A black girl is kicked out of a toy store by the owner, humiliated and told she doesn't belong. But just as she begins to walk away, something unexpected happens. Her father arrives. He's no ordinary man, and his presence turns the situation into a shocking spectacle that leaves everyone speechless. The store owner, once so arrogant, is now on his knees begging for mercy. What could this father possibly say or do to make a powerful man crumble so fast? What secret does he hold that flips the script completely? And how will this moment change the lives of everyone involved? When justice arrives, it doesn't just knock, it demands answers. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the neighborhood as Dominic Johnson and his daughter Chloe strolled down the bustling boulevard. It was their special weekend tradition, these early morning walks that let them share quiet moments together before the day truly began. Dominic walked with unhurried steps, his newspaper tucked neatly under his arm, while Chloe practically danced beside him in her favorite powder blue dress. "Look, Daddy!" Chloe's eyes sparkled as she pointed to a street musician playing a violin. The melody floated through the air, mixing with the cheerful chatter of other families out enjoying the beautiful morning. "Isn't it pretty?" Dominic smiled warmly at his daughter's enthusiasm. "It sure is, sweetheart." He watched as she swayed slightly to the music, her patent leather shoes tapping against the sidewalk. These were the moments he treasured most, seeing the world through her innocent, wonder-filled eyes. They passed several small cafes where the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries wafted onto the street. Chloe waved at a little boy about her age who was sharing a muffin with his mother at an outdoor table. The boy shyly waved back, making Chloe beam with joy. "I heard there's something special at the toy store today," Dominic said casually, watching Chloe's face light up even more, something he hadn't thought possible. "Really? What is it?" She tugged at his hand excitedly, trying to walk faster. "Well, why don't we go see for ourselves?" Dominic chuckled, letting her pull him along the sun-dappled sidewalk. As they approached the toy store, Chloe's steps slowed in awe. The storefront was elegant, with polished brass fixtures and gleaming windows that sparkled in the morning light. But what caught Chloe's attention was the magnificent dollhouse displayed in the window. It was 3 stories tall, with delicate white trim and tiny flower boxes beneath each window. Through the miniature windows, she could see perfectly arranged furniture, each piece crafted with incredible detail. "Oh, Daddy," Chloe breathed, pressing her hands against the glass. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she took in every tiny detail, from the little rocking chair on the porch to the diminutive chandelier visible through the dining room window. Dominic knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He, too, was impressed by the craftsmanship of the dollhouse. Each shingle on the roof appeared to be individually placed, and the tiny brass doorknob actually gleamed. "Would you like to go inside and take a closer look?" he asked, his voice warm with affection. The joy on Chloe's face when she turned to him made his heart swell. "Can I really?" "Of course, Princess, I just need to find a parking spot. You know how tricky it can be around here." He stood up and straightened his casual button-down shirt. "Why don't you go on in and start exploring? I'll be right back before you know it." Chloe bounced on her toes with excitement as Dominic led her to the store's entrance. The brass handle of the heavy door gleamed invitingly in the morning sun. Soft classical music drifted out whenever someone opened the door, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. "Now you stay right in the store until I come back, okay?" Dominic said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I will, Daddy, thank you." Chloe's eyes shone with anticipation as she reached for the door handle. Dominic watched with a proud smile as his daughter stepped into the store, her excitement practically radiating from her small frame. As he turned to head back to the car, his heart was full of the simple joy of making his little girl happy. The morning couldn't have been more perfect. Inside the toy store, Chloe stepped carefully across the gleaming wooden floor, her patent leather shoes making the softest clicking sounds with each step. The store was unlike any she had ever seen before, everything arranged with perfect precision, from the delicate glass figurines on high shelves to the pristinely dressed dolls that seemed to watch her with painted eyes. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, making dust motes dance in the quiet air. The distant sounds of traffic outside seemed muffled in here, as if the store existed in its own special world. Chloe's heart beat faster as she approached the dollhouse she had admired through the window. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The tiny details took her breath away. Miniature books on shelves no bigger than her thumbnail, perfectly sewn curtains that actually moved, and the smallest tea set she had ever seen arranged on a dining room table. Her hand hovered near the dollhouse, not quite touching it. She felt like she was standing in front of a precious work of art in a museum. The craftsmanship was incredible, and she wanted to memorize every detail to tell her father about when he returned. At the back of the store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood watching, her perfectly manicured fingers adjusting the strand of pearls at her neck. Her crisp white blouse and tailored skirt spoke of wealth and refinement, just like everything else in her carefully curated shop. She had noticed the young girl the moment she entered, a child alone, wearing a simple dress that, while clean and neat, clearly wasn't from the kind of stores Mrs. Whitaker's usual customers frequented. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes narrowed as she observed Chloe, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had dealt with her share of troublemakers before, children who came in just to touch things with sticky fingers or worse, slip small toys into their pockets when they thought no one was looking. Chloe, completely unaware of the scrutiny she was under, finally gathered her courage to reach out and lift one of the tiny chairs from the dollhouse. Her touch was gentle, reverent even, as she held it up to the light. The wooden chair was no bigger than a sugar cube, its detail so fine she could see the individual spindles in its back. "Oh," she whispered to herself, turning the chair carefully in her small hands. "It's perfect." The click of heels on hardwood announced Mrs. Whitaker's approach before Chloe even realized someone was coming. The store owner's steps were sharp and purposeful as she strode toward the little girl, her shadow falling over Chloe like a sudden cloud blocking the sun. "Just what do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Whitaker's voice cut through the quiet store like a knife. She loomed over Chloe, her face tight with accusation. "I suppose you thought you could just slip that into your pocket when no one was looking?" Chloe's eyes went wide with shock and confusion, her small hands beginning to tremble. The tiny chair seemed to quiver in her grasp as she looked up at Mrs. Whitaker's stern face. I wasn't..." Chloe's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Don't try to deny it." Mrs. Whitaker's voice rose sharply, echoing off the high ceiling. "I've seen your type before. Coming in here alone, pretending to look around but really just waiting for a chance to steal." Near the entrance, a few customers turned to stare, their own shopping forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. The music playing softly in the background seemed to fade away, replaced by the heavy tension that now filled the air. Chloe's lower lip began to quiver as tears welled up in her eyes, the joy of her perfect morning shattered by this sudden, unfair accusation. Chloe's small fingers trembled around the delicate dollhouse chair as Mrs. Whitaker's voice grew even sharper, cutting through the previously peaceful atmosphere of the store. The warmth of the morning sunshine seemed to fade, replaced by a cold, harsh reality that made the elegant shop feel suddenly claustrophobic. I'm not stealing," Chloe managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daddy's just parking the car, he said I could look." The words caught in her throat as tears began to well up in her eyes. "A likely story." Mrs. Whitaker's voice dripped with disdain. Her perfectly manicured hand shot out, fingers wrapping tightly around Chloe's small arm. The grip wasn't quite painful, but it was firm enough to make Chloe gasp in surprise. "We'll just see about this," Mrs. Whitaker declared, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor as she marched Chloe toward the entrance. The little girl stumbled slightly, trying to keep up with the woman's longer strides. Other customers in the store stopped browsing, their faces a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. A young mother pulled her own child closer, whispering something in the little boy's ear. An elderly gentleman frowned deeply but quickly looked away when Mrs. Whitaker's sharp gaze passed over him. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Whitaker yanked it open, dragging Chloe onto the sidewalk. The busy street seemed to pause for a moment as heads turned toward the commotion. Chloe's cheeks burned with shame as Mrs. Whitaker's voice rang out across the morning air. "This is what happens to thieves in my store," Mrs. Whitaker announced to the gathering crowd. "Parents these days, letting their children run wild, thinking they can just take whatever they want." Passers-by slowed their steps, some stopping completely to watch the scene unfold. A group of well-dressed women huddled together, whispering behind their hands. A businessman quickened his pace, pretending to be deeply engaged with his phone. The morning sun that had felt so warm and welcoming earlier now seemed harsh and exposing. "But I didn't." Chloe's voice cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. Her small body shook with silent sobs as she stood there, still clutching the tiny chair that had started all this trouble. In a sudden burst of movement, Chloe wrenched her arm free from Mrs. Whitaker's grip. The tiny chair clattered to the sidewalk as she turned and ran, her patent leather shoes slapping against the concrete. Her vision blurred with tears, she pushed through the crowd of onlookers, her small purse bouncing against her hip as she fled. The city continued its usual bustle around her, cars honking in the distance, people chattering on their phones, the screech of a bus's brakes at a nearby stop. But to Chloe, it all seemed to fade into a dull roar as she ran, her heart pounding in her ears. She wiped at her eyes with trembling hands, trying to see through her tears as she searched desperately for her father's car. Finally, through the blur of her tears, she spotted the familiar outline of her father's sedan. The sight of it, so normal, so safe, made fresh tears spill down her cheeks as she ran toward it, her chest heaving with sobs. The memory of Mrs. Whitaker's cruel words and the staring faces of strangers seemed to chase her down the sidewalk as she fled toward the only safety she knew. Dominic Johnson had just finished parallel parking his sedan, taking an extra moment to appreciate the well-maintained trees lining the street. The morning sunshine filtered through the leaves, creating dancing shadows on the sidewalk. He smiled, thinking about how much Chloe would enjoy their day together. These weekend outings had become precious moments for both of them, a chance to strengthen their bond away from the bustle of everyday life. As he stepped out of the car, straightening his casual button-down shirt, movement caught his eye. His heart stopped. Chloe was running toward him, her face streaked with tears, her Sunday dress slightly askew. Her small body shook with sobs that seemed to come from deep within her chest. "Chloe?" Dominic called out, already moving swiftly to meet her. His long legs carried him quickly across the sidewalk as concern etched itself across his features. Something was terribly wrong. He dropped to one knee, opening his arms just as Chloe crashed into him. She buried her face in his shoulder, her tiny frame trembling as she cried. Dominic wrapped his arms around her, one hand gently stroking her hair while the other held her close. "Sweetheart, what happened?" he asked softly, his voice steady despite the worry churning in his stomach. "Take deep breaths, honey, I'm right here." Chloe tried to speak, but her words came out broken between hiccuping sobs. The lady in the store, she said I was stealing." Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks as she clutched at her father's shirt. "But I wasn't, Daddy, I promise I wasn't." She grabbed my arm," Chloe continued, her voice quavering. "Everyone was looking. She took me outside and her words dissolved into more tears. Dominic's jaw tightened as he listened, though he kept his touch gentle as he cradled his daughter's head. A slow, controlled anger began to simmer beneath his calm exterior. He looked up, his eyes finding the elegant storefront sign in the distance. The fancy lettering that had seemed so welcoming earlier now seemed to mock him. "I believe you, sweetheart," he said firmly, wiping tears from Chloe's cheeks with his thumb. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all." Standing up, Dominic guided Chloe to the car, opening the passenger door with careful movements that belied the anger building inside him. He helped her into the seat, making sure she was secure. "I want you to wait here where it's safe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Lock the doors, okay? I'll be right back." Chloe nodded, her breath still hitching slightly as she settled into the familiar comfort of the car seat. Dominic closed the door softly, waiting until he heard the lock click into place. Then he turned toward the store, his eyes fixed on the sign that read Whitaker's Fine Toys. His footsteps were measured and purposeful as he began walking back toward the store's entrance. Each step carried the weight of parental protection, of justice seeking its due course. His face remained composed, but there was steel in his eyes as he approached the building where his daughter had been wronged. The morning sun cast his shadow long against the sidewalk as he walked, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The usual weekend bustle continued around him, but Dominic noticed none of it. His focus remained solely on the store's entrance ahead, where he would soon confront the person who had dared to hurt his child. Inside Whitaker's Fine Toys, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood behind the counter, her manicured fingers smoothing invisible wrinkles from her silk blouse. The morning light streaming through the front windows seemed harsh now, illuminating the tension that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. The few remaining customers huddled near the back of the store, pretending to examine merchandise while stealing uncomfortable glances in her direction. She could still feel the heat in her cheeks from the public confrontation moments ago. Something about her actions felt wrong, but she pushed the feeling aside, straightening her pearl necklace with slightly trembling fingers. The quiet ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the strained silence. The bell above the door chimed softly. Mrs. Whitaker turned, expecting another customer, but instead found herself facing a tall man in a casual button-down shirt and pressed slacks. Dominic Johnson's entrance was not dramatic. He simply walked in with the measured steps of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. His calm demeanor somehow made the atmosphere even more charged. He approached the counter with unhurried confidence, his polished shoes making soft sounds against the wooden floor. His face remained perfectly composed, but his eyes held an intensity that made Mrs. Whitaker unconsciously take a small step backward. "Do you know who I am?" His voice was quiet, controlled, yet it carried clearly through the hushed store. The question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Whitaker's throat felt dry as she shook her head slightly, her fingers now gripping the edge of the counter. The pearls around her neck suddenly felt too tight. "My name is Dominic Johnson," he continued, his tone remaining level. "I own this building." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The building that houses your store." Mrs. Whitaker's face lost its color, her carefully maintained composure cracking. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Starting today," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "I will be your biggest problem." The quiet intensity of his words seemed to echo in the silence. There was no anger in his voice, no raised volume, just absolute certainty that made his statement all the more frightening. Mrs. Whitaker's hands trembled as she gripped the counter harder. The few customers still in the store had gone completely still, watching the scene unfold. "You don't deserve the privilege of serving this community's families," Dominic stated, each word precise and measured. "Not when you treat children the way you treated my daughter." His eyes never left hers, and in them she saw not just anger but disappointment and judgment that cut deeper than any shouted threat could have. Without another word, Dominic turned and walked toward the exit, his movements as controlled as when he entered. The bell chimed again as he left, leaving Mrs. Whitaker standing frozen behind her counter, her perfectly curated world suddenly feeling very fragile. Outside, Dominic's steps quickened as he approached his car where Chloe waited. She sat in the passenger seat, her eyes still red from crying, her small hands clutching her purse in her lap. When she saw him approaching, her tense shoulders relaxed slightly. Opening the driver's door, Dominic settled into his seat and turned to his daughter. "Everything will be okay, sweetheart," he said softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "We're going to make this right." His protective presence seemed to wrap around Chloe like a warm blanket, and she managed a small nod, trusting completely in her father's quiet strength. The afternoon sun filtered through the maple trees that lined the neighborhood streets as Dominic Johnson drove his car homeward. Inside the vehicle, the air conditioning hummed softly, barely masking Chloe's occasional sniffles from the passenger seat. Her small hand still clutched her purse tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery without really seeing it. Dominic glanced at his daughter, his heart aching at the sight of her tear-stained cheeks. He cleared his throat gently, choosing his words with care. "Chloe, sweetheart, what happened today at the store was wrong. Mrs. Whitaker acted out of prejudice and hatred, and that's never okay." Chloe turned to look at him, her eyes still glistening. "But why, Daddy? I didn't do anything wrong." "No, you didn't," Dominic assured her, his voice firm but gentle. "And that's why there have to be consequences for people who treat others this way, I promise you Mrs. Whitaker will learn from this." As they pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story home, with its well-tended garden and cheerful blue shutters, Chloe seemed to relax slightly. The familiar sight of home offered some comfort after the morning's ordeal. Inside, Dominic guided Chloe to the kitchen, pulling out her favorite chair at the breakfast nook. "How about some hot cocoa?" he suggested, already reaching for the cabinet where they kept the special chocolate mix Chloe loved. Chloe nodded, watching as her father moved around the kitchen with purpose. The familiar routine of him preparing her comfort drink, the careful measuring of the chocolate powder, the gentle stirring, the dollop of whipped cream on top, seemed to create a safe bubble around them. When Dominic placed the steaming mug in front of her, decorated with a perfect swirl of whipped cream, Chloe wrapped her hands around it, seeking its warmth. "Daddy," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to look at the dollhouse. It was so pretty and I was being careful." Dominic sat down beside her, his own mug of coffee untouched. "I know, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. Sometimes people carry darkness in their hearts that makes them treat others unkindly. But that's about them, not about you." Chloe took a small sip of her cocoa, leaving a tiny whipped cream mustache on her upper lip. "But how do you know? Maybe she saw something bad in me that—" "No," Dominic interrupted firmly, reaching out to wipe the cream from her lip with a napkin. "Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, especially not by someone who judges without knowing. You are kind, gentle, and wonderful exactly as you are." Chloe's lower lip trembled and suddenly she was in her father's arms, crying fresh tears into his shirt. Dominic held her close, one hand stroking her hair soothingly, letting her release the hurt and confusion of the day. As evening approached, casting long shadows through the windows, Dominic led a tired Chloe upstairs to her bedroom. He tucked her into bed, smoothing her favorite quilt over her shoulders. "Tomorrow," he promised, kissing her forehead, "I'll start making things right." Chloe looked up at him with complete trust in her eyes. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her eyelids already growing heavy. "I love you too, sweetheart," Dominic replied softly, turning on her nightlight before quietly closing the door. Across town, in the darkening toy store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker sat alone in her office. The elegant room suddenly felt cold and unwelcoming as Dominic Johnson's words echoed in her mind. She stared at her reflection in the window, seeing for the first time how the day's events had cracked her carefully maintained facade. The early morning sun painted golden streaks across Dominic Johnson's living room floor as he stood by the window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. His coffee sat untouched on the side table, growing cold as his mind worked through the events of yesterday. The image of Chloe's tear-stained face was still fresh in his memory, fueling his determination to make things right. With careful steps, he moved to his desk, pulling out a fresh legal pad and his favorite pen. The morning silence was broken only by the scratch of his pen against paper as he began drafting his proposal. Each word was chosen with purpose, outlining a comprehensive community outreach program that would transform Mrs. Whitaker's toy store from a symbol of exclusion into a beacon of hope. "Monthly toy giveaways," he wrote, underlining the words for emphasis. "Weekly storytelling sessions open to all children. Educational workshops focusing on creativity and inclusion." His handwriting grew more confident with each line, the plan taking shape before him. As the building's owner, he knew he held significant leverage, and he intended to use it for good. Later that morning, Dominic made his way to the local community center, a modest building that buzzed with activity even in the early hours. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh paint greeted him as he walked through the doors, nodding to the regulars who knew him from his various community projects. Mr. Rafael Mendoza's office was tucked away in a quiet corner, its walls covered with children's artwork and community event flyers. The center's director looked up from his desk with a warm smile that quickly turned serious as Dominic recounted the previous day's events. "It breaks my heart to hear this, Dominic," Mr. Mendoza said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many similar incidents. "But your solution, it's exactly what our community needs. Transformation through involvement rather than punishment." Dominic leaned forward in his chair. I want to make this mandatory for her, Raphael. As part of her lease agreement, she needs to understand that serving this community is a privilege, not a burden. Mr. Mendoza nodded slowly, his eyes brightening with possibility. We could help coordinate the events, provide volunteers, make it a true community effort. By late afternoon, Dominic stood outside the toy store, the formal letter feeling heavy in his hand. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Whitaker arranging a display, her movements precise and controlled. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, announcing his presence. Mrs. Whitaker's spine stiffened as she turned to face him, her perfectly manicured hands clasping together. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice carrying a forced politeness. "I assumed I'd be seeing you." "Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic replied, his tone professional but firm. He extended the letter toward her. "This outlines the new community engagement requirements for your lease." Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the document, her face growing paler with each paragraph. This is unreasonable," she protested, looking up at him. "Free toys? Community events? This isn't good business, Mr. Johnson. I can't possibly—" "This isn't a request, Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic interrupted calmly. "This is a condition of your continued tenancy in my building." Mrs. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers crinkling the edges of the paper. She glared at Dominic, trapped between her pride and the reality of her situation. The tension in the store was palpable as she realized she had no choice but to comply. 2 days after the incident, Chloe sat at the Johnsons' kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a steaming mug of hot cocoa. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting warm patches across the wooden surface. Dominic pulled up a chair beside her, his face gentle as he spread out some papers. "Remember how I said something good can come from something bad?" he asked, his voice soft and reassuring. Chloe nodded, taking a careful sip of her cocoa. The memory of that day still made her stomach tighten, but her father's steady presence helped keep the anxiety at bay. "Well, sweetheart, we're going to start something special at that toy store," Dominic continued, sliding one of the papers toward her. "We're going to have reading times and toy-sharing events for kids who might not be able to afford new toys." Chloe's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the colorful draft of a flyer. "But, Mrs. Whitaker," she began, her voice trailing off. "Mrs. Whitaker will be there to help," Dominic assured her, carefully omitting the details of his confrontation with the store owner. Sometimes people need a chance to learn and do better. Later that morning, they walked to the nearby park, where the early spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers. Chloe made her way to the swings, her favorite spot, while Dominic noticed several parents he knew gathered near the playground equipment. Ms. Elena Brooks, a kind-faced woman whose children often played with Chloe, approached him first. "We heard about what happened at the toy store," she said, her voice carrying both concern and indignation. "How's Chloe doing?" Dominic watched his daughter pump her legs on the swing, her face more relaxed than it had been in days. "She's processing it," he replied, "but we're working on turning this into something positive for the whole community." He explained the outreach program to the small group of parents that had gathered around. Ms. Brooks nodded enthusiastically as he described the upcoming events. "That's exactly what this neighborhood needs," she said, her eyes bright with approval. "Free toys for kids who need them?" Another parent chimed in. "And regular reading sessions? That could really make a difference." The conversation hummed with cautious optimism as more parents joined the discussion, offering suggestions and support. Chloe's swinging slowed as she watched her father talking with the adults, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When they returned home that afternoon, Dominic settled at his desk with renewed purpose. He carefully wrote out the details for the first event, a children's reading and toy-sharing afternoon scheduled for 2 weeks from now. The plans included local high school students as volunteers, ensuring plenty of helping hands to make the day special. He created task lists and assignment sheets, making sure every detail was covered. The store would need to be rearranged to accommodate reading circles, and display areas would be set up for the toy-sharing portion of the event. He made notes about refreshments and name tags, wanting everything to feel welcoming and organized. After finalizing the event flyer with bright colors and cheerful fonts, Dominic printed several copies. He placed one prominently on the kitchen counter where Chloe would see it when she came down for dinner. The flyer promised stories, sharing, and smiles in bold letters across the top, transforming what had been a place of hurt into something hopeful. In the grand townhouse that the Whitakers called home, 10-year-old Sophie sat curled up in her favorite window seat, a well-worn book of fairy tales open on her lap. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors and illuminating the gilded frames of numerous family portraits that lined the walls. The peaceful scene was interrupted by her mother's sharp voice carrying from the next room. Sophie's fingers tightened on the edges of her book as she heard Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's heels clicking rapidly across the floor, accompanied by angry muttering. "How dare he, the audacity!" Mrs. Whitaker's voice rose and fell as she paced. Sophie shrunk deeper into her window seat, trying to focus on her story about magical kingdoms and happy endings, but her mother's distress was impossible to ignore. In her home office, Mrs. Whitaker clutched the formal letter from Dominic Johnson, her manicured nails creasing the expensive paper. Her face flushed with anger as she reread the requirements: regular community events, discounted toys, free giveaways. The very thought made her stomach churn. She paused by her mahogany desk, her reflection catching in the ornate mirror on the wall. The proud, composed woman she usually saw looked decidedly less confident today. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the letter and began to pace again. "I could call Richard," she muttered, referring to her lawyer. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. A legal battle would mean scrutiny she couldn't afford. Her mind wandered to the carefully hidden ledgers in her office safe, the ones that didn't quite match the official records. The late Mrs. Henderson's investment in the store had been creatively documented. If anyone started digging, Mrs. Whitaker sank into her leather chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. Perhaps she could appear to cooperate while finding another solution. Yes, that might work. Play along for now, keep things quiet, and search for a way to maintain control of her store without exposing herself to investigation. Later that afternoon, Sophie wandered down the alley behind the toy store, kicking small pebbles as she walked. The back entrance had always fascinated her. It seemed more real somehow than the polished storefront her mother maintained. A movement caught her eye, and she looked up to see a girl about her age walking past, carrying a stack of colorful papers. The girl, Chloe, paused when she noticed Sophie, offering a small, tentative wave. Sophie felt her own hand lift in response, a shy smile crossing her face. There was something about the other girl that drew her in. Maybe it was the gentle way she moved, or the hint of sadness in her eyes that seemed at odds with her friendly gesture. Neither girl spoke, but in that brief moment of connection, Sophie felt a warmth she rarely experienced in her carefully ordered world. As Chloe continued on her way, Sophie found herself turning back to watch her go, wondering who this girl was and why she seemed both kind and wounded at the same time. Sophie clutched her book closer to her chest, standing in the alley long after Chloe had disappeared from view. The encounter left her with an odd feeling, a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. It was so different from the tense atmosphere at home, where her mother's anger still simmered behind closed doors. On a bright Tuesday morning, Dominic Johnson's sedan pulled up to the Sunshine Children's Shelter, a modest two-story building with cheerful murals decorating its walls. Children's artwork decorated the windows, and the sound of laughter drifted from the playground around back. He straightened his tie and gathered a stack of colorful flyers from the passenger seat. Inside, the shelter's coordinator, Ms. Angela Foster, welcomed him with a warm smile. Her office was cluttered but cozy, with children's drawings pinned to every available surface and a jar of candy on her desk for young visitors. "Mr. Johnson, it's wonderful to meet you," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I've heard so much about your work in the community." Dominic settled into the chair and shared his vision for the upcoming event. As he spoke about transforming the toy store into a place of inclusion and healing, Ms. Foster's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "This is exactly what our children need," she exclaimed, leaning forward. "Many of them have never experienced the simple joy of walking into a toy store without feeling out of place." Meanwhile, at Lincoln Elementary School, Chloe Johnson sat alone on a wooden bench during recess. The playground buzzed with excited chatter about the upcoming toy store event. Groups of children huddled together, discussing which toys they hoped to see and what activities might be planned. Chloe pulled her jacket tighter around herself despite the warm weather. The memory of Mrs. Whitaker's accusation still made her cheeks burn with shame. She watched her classmates play, feeling disconnected from their excitement. "Hey, Chloe!" A friendly voice broke through her thoughts. Jasmine Lee, wearing a bright yellow sweater and carrying a jump rope, approached the bench. "Why do you look so serious? Haven't you heard about the cool thing happening at the toy store?" Chloe managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I heard," she said softly. Jasmine plopped down beside her. "My mom says there's going to be storytelling and games and everything. Aren't you excited?" Chloe nodded, grateful for Jasmine's kindness but unable to share the real reason for her hesitation. The bell rang, saving her from having to explain further. Later that afternoon, Dominic's living room transformed into an impromptu meeting space. Mr. Rafael Mendoza sat in an armchair, his experience running the community center evident in his thoughtful suggestions. Ms. Elena Brooks perched on the couch, notebook in hand, while Ms. Angela Foster contributed ideas from her perspective working with shelter children. "We need to make sure every child feels welcome," Mr. Mendoza emphasized, his voice carrying the weight of years working with youth. "This isn't just about one event, it's about changing hearts." Ms. Brooks nodded, jotting down notes. "What about starting with a storytelling circle? It could help break the ice." "And we should have name tags," Ms. Foster added. "It helps the children feel recognized as individuals." Dominic listened carefully to each suggestion, occasionally glancing at a photo of Chloe on the mantel. "Mrs. Whitaker will need to be actively involved," he said firmly. "This isn't about public shame. It's about learning and growing. She needs to see these children as people, not problems." The group continued planning well into the evening, their voices filled with hope and purpose. They arranged activities, selected books that celebrated diversity and kindness, and carefully considered how to guide Mrs. Whitaker toward genuine interaction with the children. The morning sun cast long shadows through the toy store's windows as Dominic Johnson stepped inside, a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm. The store was quiet, with only a few early customers browsing the aisles. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood behind the counter, her spine stiffening as she noticed his approach. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic said, his voice steady and professional. He placed the envelope on the counter between them. "This contains the complete schedule and requirements for next week's community event." Mrs. Whitaker's perfectly manicured fingers hesitated before touching the envelope. "I assume I have no choice in this matter?" "Your lease agreement is quite clear," Dominic replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. Section 12.3 specifically addresses community impact clauses. Given recent events, these requirements fall well within my rights as property owner. He opened the envelope and began laying out documents one by one. "You'll be expected to participate in the storytelling sessions, assist with toy demonstrations, and personally welcome each child who attends." His tone left no room for negotiation. "The event begins at 10 a.m. sharp. We've arranged for 30 children from the shelter to attend, along with their caretakers." Mrs. Whitaker's face paled slightly as she scanned the detailed schedule. Her fingers drummed nervously on the counter's surface. After Dominic left, Mrs. Whitaker retreated to her office, locking the door behind her. She pulled out a worn leather ledger from the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. Her hands trembled as she flipped through its pages. There, in neat columns, lay the evidence of her deception. False entries masked the late Mr. Thompson's substantial investment in the store, money she had quietly redirected to her personal accounts after his death. Her eyes lingered on the doctored numbers, each one a reminder of her betrayal of trust. She reached for her phone, then stopped. Calling her accountant might draw unwanted attention. Besides, these records were too damaging to share with anyone. The weight of her secrets pressed down on her shoulders as she realized how vulnerable she had become. "If Johnson starts asking questions," she whispered to herself, her voice trailing off. The thought of a full audit made her stomach churn. She had built her reputation on appearing above reproach, But now that carefully constructed facade was at risk of crumbling. Later that evening in the Whitakers' elegant townhouse, Sophie padded quietly down the hallway in her sock feet. The house felt unusually still, heavy with unspoken tension. Warm lamplight spilled from beneath her mother's study door. Sophie approached cautiously, drawn by the sound of papers rustling and her mother's muffled sighs. Through the crack in the door, she could see Mrs. Whitaker hunched over her desk, surrounded by stacks of documents. Her mother's usual perfect posture was gone, replaced by defeated shoulders and worried eyes. Sophie had never seen her mother look so vulnerable. The sight made her chest tight with concern. She watched as Mrs. Whitaker removed her reading glasses and pressed her fingers against her temples, the worry lines on her forehead deeper than usual. Clutching her favorite book, a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden, Sophie retreated silently to her bedroom. She curled up in her window seat, the book hugged close to her chest. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The certainty she had always felt about her life, about who they were as a family, suddenly seemed less solid. Through her window, she could see lights coming on in neighboring houses as families settled in for the evening. She wondered if other families had secrets too, if other mothers sat alone in their studies looking as worried as hers did tonight. In the administrative wing of his building, Dominic sat at his desk surrounded by stacks of insurance paperwork for the upcoming event. Sunlight streamed through the window as he methodically reviewed each document. As he reached for another folder, his hand brushed against an old filing cabinet drawer that was slightly ajar. Curious, he pulled it open and found previous year's rental agreements for the toy store. Something caught his eye: inconsistencies in the payment records that didn't align with standard procedures. Dominic frowned, noting unusual modifications to the original lease terms and several questionable amendments that hadn't been properly documented. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, pulling out his notebook. The numbers told a concerning story, one of potential fraud and misrepresented finances. He jotted down specific dates and figures that warranted closer examination. Meanwhile, Chloe walked slowly along the sidewalk near the toy store, her heart beating faster as she approached the familiar storefront. She noticed a girl about her age sitting against the building's side wall, completely absorbed in a paperback book. It was Sophie Whitaker, her long dark hair partially hiding her face as she read. Chloe hesitated, then took a few steps closer. "Hi," she said softly. Sophie looked up, startled but not upset. Her grip on her book tightened slightly. "I like books too," Chloe added, gesturing to Sophie's novel. "What are you reading?" Sophie tilted the book so Chloe could see the cover. "It's about a secret garden," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sounds nice," Chloe said, offering a gentle smile. "I just finished a book about a magical dollhouse." Something in Sophie's expression softened at the mention of dollhouses. They exchanged a few more words about their favorite stories before Chloe excused herself, leaving Sophie watching her retreat with curious eyes. When Chloe arrived home, she found her father in his study, surrounded by papers. Dominic looked up and smiled warmly. "How are you feeling about next week's event, sweetheart?" he asked, setting aside the troubling financial documents he'd discovered. "I think it might be okay," Chloe replied quietly, thinking of Sophie's shy but kind face. Dominic nodded encouragingly, but his mind wandered to the suspicious records on his desk. What had started as a simple community outreach program was revealing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. He studied the notes he'd made earlier, knowing these discrepancies required careful investigation. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Dominic's home office, casting long shadows across his desk. He methodically spread out lease agreements and store ledgers, his trained eye catching discrepancy after discrepancy. Years of business experience had taught him to spot the telltale signs of financial misconduct, and Mrs. Whitaker's records were full of them. "Unaccounted funds here," he muttered, marking another entry. "Inflated expenses there." Each new discovery built a clearer picture of deliberate deception. Dominic rubbed his temples, considering the delicate balance required. The community event was meant to heal wounds, not create new ones with a public scandal. Later that day, the bell above the toy store door chimed as Dominic entered. He found Mrs. Whitaker behind the counter, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied inventory invoices with visible tension in her shoulders. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic said quietly, approaching the counter. "I've been reviewing some paperwork." She looked up, her fingers tightening on the papers before her. "Oh?" "I found some concerning irregularities in the financial records," he continued, keeping his voice steady and neutral. "Numbers that don't quite add up." Mrs. Whitaker's spine stiffened. "I'm sure you must be mistaken," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "The accounts are perfectly in order." "We both know that's not true." Dominic maintained eye contact. "You have a choice here. You can make this right before the community event. Admit to the discrepancies, work out a plan to correct them. Or you can continue denying and risk losing everything when a formal audit reveals the truth." Mrs. Whitaker's face paled, but her chin lifted defiantly. "You're wrong. You've simply misunderstood the numbers." As evening settled over the city, Mrs. Whitaker paced her office like a caged animal. The cheerful twinkle of the store's window display seemed to mock her predicament. Her mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps she could doctor more records, create a paper trail that would explain away the inconsistencies. Or maybe she could find someone else to blame, a former employee perhaps. She paused at her desk, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper to list potential excuses and explanations. Despite Dominic's offer of redemption, she couldn't bring herself to consider honest solutions. Instead, her pen scratched across the paper as she plotted ways to manipulate the upcoming event to her advantage, searching for angles to shift suspicion away from herself. The morning air held a gentle crispness as Chloe made her way across the schoolyard, clutching a worn library book to her chest. Her eyes caught sight of Sophie sitting alone near the fence, completely absorbed in her own book. After a moment's hesitation, Chloe gathered her courage and walked over. "Hi, Sophie," she said softly. "What are you reading?" Sophie looked up, her initial surprise melting into a small smile. "It's a fairy tale collection," she replied, turning the book so Chloe could see its cover. "I just finished one about a princess who breaks a curse through kindness instead of fighting back." Chloe's eyes lit up. "That sounds wonderful," she said, settling carefully beside Sophie. "Sometimes being kind is harder than being angry, isn't it?" During recess, the two girls found a quiet spot beneath an ancient oak tree. Its spreading branches created a peaceful sanctuary away from the noisy playground. Chloe pulled out her sketchbook and showed Sophie her latest drawing, a detailed dollhouse surrounded by children of all kinds, their faces bright with joy. Sophie traced the pencil lines with gentle fingers. "There are so many different children here," she observed. "Why did you draw it that way?" Chloe smoothed the paper's corner. "I think toys and stories should make everyone happy," she explained carefully. "When people feel welcome, amazing things can happen." Later that afternoon, Sophie stepped into her house, the warmth of her conversation with Chloe still lingering. She found her mother in the study, surrounded by papers and wearing a deep frown. Mrs. Whitaker barely glanced up when Sophie entered, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. Sophie stood in the doorway, watching her mother's distracted movements. The words about Chloe's kindness hovered on her lips, but something in her mother's tense posture made her hesitate. Instead, she quietly retreated to her favorite window seat, opening her fairy tale book once more. As she settled into the cushions, Sophie wondered if the princess in her story had felt this same mix of hope and uncertainty before choosing the path of kindness. The community center buzzed with activity as Dominic Johnson spread papers across a worn wooden table. Mr. Rafael Mendoza, Ms. Elena Brooks, and Ms. Angela Foster gathered around, their faces bright with purpose. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as they mapped out the upcoming outreach event. "The storytelling corner will go here," Dominic said, pointing to a diagram. "We'll need comfortable cushions and good lighting." Ms. Angela Foster nodded eagerly. "The children from the shelter love interactive stories. I can bring our collection of puppets." "And the toy giveaway table?" Ms. Elena Brooks asked, leaning forward. "Central location," Mr. Mendoza suggested, "where Mrs. Whitaker can't avoid participating." Across town, in the toy store's cramped back office, Mrs. Whitaker sat across from Mr. Lionel Pierce. The accountant's expensive suit seemed out of place among dusty storage boxes. Shadows from a single desk lamp cast dark patterns on the wall. "It's delicate," Mr. Pierce said, examining the ledgers. "These discrepancies won't be easy to explain away." Mrs. Whitaker's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "But you can do it? For a price?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's say 30% of what we're hiding?" Mrs. Whitaker's face paled, but she nodded. The scratching of his pen against paper seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Later that afternoon, Chloe walked home from the community center, her mind full of the exciting plans. Movement caught her eye. Sophie was slipping out of the store's side entrance, her school bag hanging heavily on one shoulder. Their eyes met across the street. Chloe raised her hand in a friendly wave. Sophie returned the gesture tentatively, her smile small but genuine. In that brief exchange, Chloe saw something familiar in Sophie's eyes, the same uncertainty she'd felt when dealing with difficult situations. Though Sophie hurried away, Chloe felt a deeper connection forming, an understanding that went beyond their shared love of books and stories. The morning sun had barely risen when Dominic Johnson stood outside the toy store, a carefully worded letter in his hand. He slipped the crisp white envelope under the door, his movements deliberate and quiet. Inside, he had written his final appeal to Mrs. Whitaker's conscience, laying out the stakes with crystal clarity. The letter explained how coming clean now, before the community event, would preserve her dignity far better than a public exposure of her financial misconduct. Later that morning, Mrs. Whitaker's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she entered her store. The envelope caught her eye immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore it open, eyes scanning the words that made her stomach twist into knots. Dominic Johnson's message was unmistakable. He knew everything and wouldn't hesitate to reveal it all. With a sudden burst of anger, she crumpled the paper and threw it toward the wastebasket. The familiar shelves of toys that usually brought her comfort now seemed to loom over her accusingly. The first customers of the day wandered in, and Mrs. Whitaker forced her lips into a smile that felt like a mask. As she rang up purchases and answered questions about prices, her mind raced with the weight of her choices. For the first time, she wondered if facing the truth might actually hurt less than maintaining her elaborate deceptions. That evening, in the quiet of their living room, Mrs. Whitaker sat in her favorite armchair, staring blankly at an untouched cup of tea. Sophie padded into the room in her sock feet, her voice bright and innocent as she mentioned Chloe Johnson's name. "Chloe seems really nice, Mom," Sophie said, settling onto the couch. "I can't wait for the store event." Mrs. Whitaker's hand jerked, nearly knocking over her teacup. The mention of Chloe's name sent a wave of guilt washing over her face before she could hide it. Sophie leaned forward, concern crossing her young features. "Is everything okay, Mom?" "Of course, sweetheart," Mrs. Whitaker replied, her voice artificially light. "Everything's fine." But Sophie heard the hollow ring in her mother's words, and the space between them filled with unspoken questions. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as Mrs. Whitaker avoided her daughter's searching gaze. The autumn breeze carried excited whispers through the neighborhood, as children gathered in small groups, pointing at the colorful posters that decorated lampposts and shop windows. The community outreach event at the toy store had become the talk of the town. Chloe Johnson sat on the school steps during morning break, watching her classmates bubble with anticipation about the free toys and storytelling sessions to come. "I heard they're giving away dolls just like the ones in the fancy window display," one girl squealed to her friend. Chloe managed a gentle smile, though her heart still held a touch of sadness. The memory of Mrs. Whitaker's harsh accusation flickered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, choosing instead to focus on the possibility of something good emerging from that painful day. During lunch period, the schoolyard bustled with activity. Jasmine Lee spotted Chloe sitting alone under the big oak tree and made her way over, her lunchbox swinging at her side. "Are you excited about Saturday?" Jasmine asked, settling down beside Chloe. "Everyone's talking about it." Chloe pulled at the grass beside her shoe. "I am, but—" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm kind of nervous too." What if Mrs. Whitaker doesn't really want to change? What if she's just pretending? Jasmine placed a reassuring hand on Chloe's shoulder, her touch warm and sisterly. You know what my grandma always says? Sometimes people can really surprise you. When kindness meets truth, real change can happen. Meanwhile, across town, Dominic Johnson's sedan idled quietly outside the toy store. Through the gleaming storefront windows, he observed Mrs. Whitaker methodically arranging a display of stuffed animals. Her movements seemed too precise, too controlled, like someone trying desperately to maintain composure. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted a teddy bear's bow tie for the third time. Dominic glanced down at his phone, reviewing the detailed checklist for Saturday's event. Every activity had been carefully planned to create an atmosphere of inclusion and healing. But everything hinged on Mrs. Whitaker's choice. Would she embrace this opportunity for redemption, or would her secrets finally catch up with her? With a quiet sigh, Dominic started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he left Mrs. Whitaker alone with her conscience and the weight of her decisions. In Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's dimly lit office, Mr. Lionel Pierce laid out the revised ledgers across her mahogany desk. His manicured fingers smoothed the crisp pages as he explained the alterations. "These documents show it was all just bookkeeping confusion," he said with practiced confidence. "Simple mistakes that any business owner could make." Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the papers. The numbers seemed to swim before her eyes, neat columns of carefully crafted lies. Though relief washed over her, an undercurrent of unease remained. If Dominic Johnson decided to dig deeper, these fabricated records wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny. "Thank you," she said stiffly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Pierce nodded curtly and left, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the weight of more deception. Outside the store, Sophie Whitaker paused by the display window. New handmade crafts from the community center filled a special corner. Colorful paper flowers, painted wooden figures, and tiny cloth dolls. Each item seemed to radiate warmth and care. She thought of Chloe Johnson's drawings, remembering how the other girl had included children of all kinds playing together. The simple kindness of that gesture made Sophie's heart ache when she compared it to the tense atmosphere at home. These past few days, she had watched her mother grow more agitated, making hushed phone calls and shuffling papers late into the night. Sophie wondered if telling the truth might actually bring her mother peace. Maybe facing reality would be better than living in fear of discovery. Though she didn't know exactly what to do, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest. In his study, Dominic Johnson methodically arranged his documentation. Photocopies of suspicious bank statements lay beside a carefully prepared list of pointed questions. He wouldn't let Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's dishonesty poison tomorrow's event, but he was ready if she chose to maintain her deception. The evidence would speak for itself, though he planned to reveal it tactfully if necessary. Standing up from his desk, Dominic stepped out onto his front porch. The evening air carried the soft sounds of families settling in for the night. Porch lights winked on one by one down the street as darkness gathered. He took a deep breath, mentally preparing for tomorrow's gathering and whatever truth it might bring to light. Early morning sunlight streamed through the Johnsons' kitchen windows, casting warm patterns across their breakfast table. Chloe Johnson stirred her cereal slowly, watching the pieces swim in circles while her father finished his coffee. The quiet of the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the day to unfold. "Remember, sweetheart," Dominic Johnson said gently, "today isn't about what happened before. It's about showing everyone how kindness can change things." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Sometimes one good deed can start something wonderful, like dropping a pebble in a pond and watching the ripples spread." Chloe Johnson nodded, her spoon pausing mid-stir. "I know, Dad," she said softly. Though nervous butterflies danced in her stomach, she sat up straighter, determined to help make the day special. At the toy store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she moved from shelf to shelf. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted picture books and straightened rows of small toys on the activity table. The morning light caught dust motes dancing in the air, making the store seem almost magical. But she couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in her chest. Sophie Whitaker appeared in the doorway, her quiet presence causing her mother to startle slightly. "I hope everyone has fun today," Sophie Whitaker said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker attempted a smile but couldn't quite meet her daughter's eyes as she continued arranging items on the table. Just before lunch, Dominic Johnson stood outside the store, watching the event banner flutter in the breeze. The bright colors announced Community Day in cheerful letters, promising welcome and warmth to all who would attend. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stiffened as their eyes met. They exchanged curt nods, the tension palpable in the air between them. "The children will be arriving soon," Dominic Johnson said evenly. "Both from the shelter and the neighborhood." His calm voice carried the weight of expectation. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker nodded stiffly, her fingers fidgeting with a stack of coloring books. She knew there was nowhere to hide from what was coming. She would have to face the community and their judgment, one way or another. The sidewalk outside the toy store buzzed with growing excitement as families began to gather. Children pointed at the colorful banners, while parents chatted in small groups. Mr. Rafael Mendoza arrived with several kids from the community center, their eager faces scanning the window displays. Ms. Elena Brooks efficiently set up a craft table, laying out supplies with practiced care. "Look at all the colors," one small child exclaimed as Ms. Angela Foster guided her group from the shelter toward the entrance. The children's eyes sparkled with anticipation, taking in the festive atmosphere. Dominic Johnson moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with warm handshakes and genuine smiles. His attention never strayed far from the store's entrance, where Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood rigid and formal, her welcoming smile not quite reaching her eyes. Inside the quiet store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's fingers fumbled with paper name tags for the reading circle. She arranged and rearranged them, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Sophie Whitaker stood near a tall bookshelf, watching her mother's nervous movements. "Mom," Sophie Whitaker said softly, "I met Chloe Johnson at school." She hesitated before continuing. "She's really nice. I think today could be good for everyone if we're just honest about things." Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's hands froze over the name tags. She turned to look at her daughter, struck by the simple wisdom in those words. Unable to find the right response, she gave a tight nod and returned to her task. Near the store's entrance, Chloe Johnson clutched a bright flyer announcing the storytime session. Her friend Jasmine Lee appeared beside her, wrapping her in a quick, encouraging hug. Chloe Johnson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to face the crowd. Dominic Johnson stepped up behind his daughter, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. The gesture seemed to give Chloe Johnson the courage she needed. Together, they walked through the doorway, leading the way for the rest of the community. The assembled crowd followed them inside, their footsteps and whispers filling the space with anticipation. The toy store hummed with the gentle murmur of children's voices, as volunteers took turns reading stories from colorful picture books. Sunlight streamed through the polished windows, casting warm patches across the gathered families. Small groups of children sat on cushions arranged in neat circles, their faces turned up eagerly toward each reader. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood near the back wall, her fingers nervously smoothing her silk blouse. Her eyes kept drifting to where Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker sat together on a plush reading mat. The two girls leaned close, sharing whispered comments about the story being read, a tale of two unlikely friends who learned to overcome their fears together. Chloe Johnson pointed to an illustration, and Sophie Whitaker nodded, a genuine smile lighting up her usually reserved face. The volunteer's animated voice filled the space, and so the rabbit and the fox discovered that friendship was stronger than any difference between them. The children listened intently, some clutching small stuffed animals from the store's shelves. Dominic Johnson moved to the center of the room with measured steps. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, and conversations naturally quieted as he cleared his throat. "I want to thank everyone for joining us today," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the store. "This event wouldn't be possible without our host, Mrs. Whitaker, who has opened her store to our community." Mrs. Margaret Whitaker felt her chest tighten as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Parents nodded politely, while children looked at her with innocent curiosity. Dominic Johnson's gaze met hers steadily, his expression both challenging and encouraging. The weight of his unspoken message pressed down on her shoulders. This was her chance to transform a moment of shame into one of redemption. "We're here today," Dominic Johnson continued, "not just to share stories and toys, but to strengthen the bonds that make our neighborhood special. When we open our doors to each other, we open our hearts as well." Mrs. Margaret Whitaker shifted her weight from one foot to the other, acutely aware of how his words highlighted her past actions. The fraudulent ledgers in her office seemed to burn through the walls, a secret weight threatening to crush her carefully maintained facade. As the final story concluded, Ms. Angela Foster emerged from the back room pushing a cart loaded with carefully wrapped packages. "Who's ready for some special surprises?" she announced cheerfully. Children straightened up, their eyes widening with excitement. They formed a line without being asked, each one practically vibrating with anticipation. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker forced herself to walk behind the counter, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She lifted the first wrapped package, a simple board game tied with a blue ribbon. A small boy with glasses too big for his face stepped forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly, accepting the gift with both hands. His genuine gratitude, unmarred by any knowledge of adult complications, struck her like a physical blow. She felt something crack in her carefully constructed armor. Looking at his beaming face, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker remembered why she'd opened the toy store in the first place. Not for profit or prestige, but for moments like these. The weight of her deceptions suddenly felt unbearable against the pure joy radiating from the child before her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the next package. The choice loomed before her like a crossroads: continue down the path of deception, or step into the light of truth. The children's laughter echoed through the store, a reminder of innocence she'd forgotten somewhere along the way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the store windows as parents exchanged meaningful glances. A quiet anticipation settled over the adults in the room, their hushed conversations carrying undertones of expectation. They had heard whispers about the incident with Chloe Johnson, and many hoped for some kind of acknowledgement or reconciliation. Dominic Johnson maintained his position near a carefully arranged display of porcelain dolls, his presence both reassuring and watchful. The financial documents in his jacket pocket felt heavy with significance. He'd spent hours verifying every discrepancy, ensuring he had concrete evidence if Mrs. Margaret Whitaker chose deception over truth. His eyes never left her as she handed out the last few toys, noting how her practiced smile wavered each time a child thanked her. Across the room, Chloe Johnson sat cross-legged on a cushioned mat beside Sophie Whitaker. The two girls had gravitated toward each other throughout the afternoon, sharing quiet comments about the stories and crafts. As volunteers began moving the reading circle to a sunnier corner, Chloe Johnson leaned closer to Sophie Whitaker. "Thank you for being kind to me," Chloe Johnson whispered, her voice carrying a warmth that made Sophie Whitaker's cheeks flush pink. Sophie Whitaker ducked her head, pleased by the friendship being offered so freely. She snuck a glance at her mother, who was straightening a row of stuffed animals with trembling hands. "I wish—" Sophie Whitaker started to whisper back, then fell silent. But Chloe Johnson seemed to understand. The two girls exchanged knowing looks, their shared hope for Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's redemption creating an unspoken bond between them. Ms. Elena Brooks stepped forward, her cheerful voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Everyone, we have a special treat. Mrs. Whitaker has agreed to read our next story." She gestured toward a plush armchair positioned at the front of the reading area. The room fell silent as Mrs. Margaret Whitaker made her way to the chair. Children settled onto cushions, looking up at her with innocent expectation. She picked up the storybook with unsteady fingers, clearing her throat as she opened to the first page. "The brave little truth-teller," she began, her voice initially strong and clear. The story unfolded, telling of a young rabbit who had made a mistake and hidden it from his forest friends. As she reached the pivotal moment where the rabbit finally confessed his wrongdoing to the other animals, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's voice caught. I was wrong," she read, the rabbit's words seeming to stick in her throat. "And I'm sorry for not telling the truth." A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the afternoon light. She tried to continue but found herself staring at the page, the words blurring before her eyes. The assembled parents and volunteers watched intently, sensing the parallels between the story and reality. Dominic Johnson shifted slightly, ready to step forward if needed. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker looked up from the book, meeting the expectant faces of dozens of children and their parents. The weight of her secrets pressed down on her shoulders as she realized she could no longer hide behind carefully crafted lies. The store fell silent as Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's voice trailed off, the storybook trembling in her hands. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the tears that now glistened on her cheeks. The children sat perfectly still on their cushions, sensing the weight of the moment. Even the usual shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing seemed muted, as if the whole room held its breath. Dominic Johnson moved forward with measured steps, his presence both supportive and watchful. He stopped a few feet from Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's chair, giving her the space to make her choice. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a quiet encouragement. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker lowered the book to her lap, her fingers pressing into its covers as if seeking strength. She drew in a shaking breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried throughout the hushed store. I need to tell you all something," she began, her words barely above a whisper. "I've made terrible mistakes. Mistakes that have hurt people." Her gaze found Chloe Johnson in the crowd. "I treated an innocent child with cruelty because of my own prejudices. I let fear and suspicion poison my heart." She paused, struggling to maintain her composure as quiet gasps rippled through the assembled parents. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, drawn in by her raw honesty. "And there's more," Mrs. Margaret Whitaker continued, her voice breaking. "I haven't been honest in my business dealings. I've let greed guide my actions, manipulating numbers, hiding the truth." Her hands twisted in her lap as she forced herself to continue. "I've betrayed the trust of this community in more ways than one." The admission hung heavy in the air. Dominic Johnson's expression remained solemn, though relief flickered briefly across his features. He knew the courage it took to speak these words. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker turned fully toward Chloe Johnson, tears now flowing freely. "Chloe, what I did to you was inexcusable. I accused you without cause, humiliated you publicly, and caused you pain that no child should ever experience. I am so deeply sorry." The silence that followed was profound. Chloe Johnson stood near the front, her eyes wide and glistening with unexpected tears. The other children watched her, waiting to see how she would respond. Ms. Angela Foster moved through the crowd with quiet grace. She reached Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's side and gently took her trembling hand. "Admitting our mistakes is the first step," she said, her voice warm and steady. "If you're willing to make amends, to work hard at rebuilding trust, this community can forgive. We can help you make things right." The children glanced at each other, their young faces showing confusion mixed with hope. Some smiled hesitantly, while others looked to their parents for cues on how to react. Then Chloe Johnson stepped forward, her small figure straight and sure. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the quiet room. "Thank you for saying sorry," she said simply, her words free of bitterness or judgment. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's composure finally broke completely. She covered her face with her hands as tears flowed freely, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The walls she had built around herself for so long began to crumble, swept away by the pure forgiveness in a child's voice. In that moment, the atmosphere in the store shifted palpably. Where there had been tension, now there was the first tender shoot of understanding. Where there had been judgment, now there was the possibility of redemption. The store remained hushed in the wake of Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's confession, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the polished floor. Parents exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and cautious acceptance. No angry voices rose, no accusations flew. Instead, a gentle murmur of whispered conversations filled the space. Dominic Johnson stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the quiet store. He stood before Mrs. Margaret Whitaker, his presence commanding yet compassionate. Acknowledging the truth isn't easy, he said, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. The road ahead will be challenging, but this is the first step. Let's work together to restore what's been broken and make this store a place that truly serves our community. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders still trembling slightly. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll return every penny I took. Open all the books for proper auditing. This store, it needs to become what it should have been all along. A place where every child feels welcome and valued." Sophie Whitaker moved closer to her mother, tears streaming down her young face. She slipped her small hand into her mother's, squeezing gently. The simple gesture seemed to give Mrs. Margaret Whitaker strength, and she squeezed back, drawing her daughter close. Chloe Johnson watched this tender moment, her heart full of unexpected warmth. She took a few steps toward Sophie Whitaker, offering a smile that spoke volumes, a smile of friendship and understanding that needed no words. As the afternoon light began to soften, Dominic Johnson excused himself briefly and returned carrying a familiar box. Chloe Johnson's eyes widened as she recognized the dollhouse from the window display, the very one that had started everything. "Happy early birthday, sweetheart," Dominic Johnson said softly. Chloe Johnson's gasp of delight filled the room. She threw her arms around her father, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. From across the room, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker observed this scene, watching as the store that had once been a place of hurt transformed into one of joy. She stood quietly, hands clasped together, understanding that while forgiveness had been offered, she would need to earn back trust through actions, not just words. The morning sun streamed through the toy store's freshly cleaned windows, casting warm squares of light across the polished wooden floors. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker sat at her small writing desk, her shoulders tense but determined as she gripped her pen. The blank paper before her waited for words that would mark a new beginning. "Dear community members," she wrote, her usually confident handwriting showing hints of trembling. She outlined her commitment to change, free weekly storytelling sessions, craft workshops open to all children, and cultural exchange activities that would celebrate the neighborhood's diversity. Each promise felt both daunting and necessary. Sophie Whitaker appeared silently in the doorway, watching her mother work. When Mrs. Margaret Whitaker glanced up, Sophie Whitaker offered an encouraging nod, her eyes bright with hope. The simple gesture gave Mrs. Margaret Whitaker strength to continue writing. Later, the afternoon sun had shifted when Dominic Johnson arrived for their scheduled meeting. In the back office, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker handed over thick folders containing bank statements and contracts, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. "Everything is here," she said quietly. "All the records." Dominic Johnson accepted the documents with a respectful nod, noting the completeness of the files. "I suggest we hire an independent accountant," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Someone both parties approve to oversee the restitution process and ensure complete transparency moving forward." Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's fingers twisted in her lap, but she nodded. "Yes, that would be appropriate. I want to do this properly." As the day progressed, the store's bell chimed as Chloe Johnson entered with her father. She paused just inside, taking in the changes. New signs decorated the walls, promising Community Story Hour and free toy crafts in cheerful colors. The whole space felt lighter, more welcoming. Near a corner shelf, Sophie Whitaker knelt beside a cardboard box filled with old storybooks, carefully sorting them by reading level. She looked up as Chloe Johnson approached, and their eyes met. Both girls shared a warm smile, the gesture carrying the weight of understanding and the promise of friendship. The store that had once housed such painful memories now held the potential for something new and beautiful. The neighborhood buzzed with renewed energy as Dominic Johnson sat in the community center's meeting room with Mr. Rafael Mendoza and Ms. Angela Foster. Sunlight filtered through the windows as they discussed plans for monthly reading festivals at the toy store. "We could feature different cultures each month," Ms. Angela Foster suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The children from the shelter would love to participate." Mr. Rafael Mendoza nodded, spreading out a calendar on the table. This could really bring everyone together. Different backgrounds, different stories, but all sharing the same space. Meanwhile, inside the toy store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker and Ms. Elena Brooks arranged plump cushions in various cheerful colors around a low wooden table. Picture books lined newly installed shelves at child height, their spines creating a rainbow effect against the wall. "The children will feel so comfortable here," Ms. Elena Brooks said, adjusting a final pillow. A few curious children peeked through the store's window. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker walked to the door and opened it, welcoming them with a warm smile. Not the stiff, formal expression she once wore, but something genuine and kind. Sophie Whitaker, arranging books nearby, watched her mother interact with the young visitors. Her heart swelled with quiet joy at the change she witnessed. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, a small crowd gathered outside the store. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood beside a beautifully decorated box labeled "Toys for Tots in Need." She had painted it herself in cheerful colors, with pictures of teddy bears and toy cars around the edges. "Every child deserves to feel special," Mrs. Margaret Whitaker announced, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd. Gentle applause rippled through the gathered neighbors, some of whom had previously turned away in disapproval after the incident with Chloe Johnson. Chloe Johnson herself stood at the edge of the group, watching the scene unfold. When Mrs. Margaret Whitaker's eyes met hers, they exchanged a simple nod, a quiet acknowledgement of how far things had come. The crowd continued to applaud softly as Mrs. Margaret Whitaker placed the first donation in the box, a brand new teddy bear wearing a red ribbon. A few weeks passed and the toy store hummed with the sounds of children's laughter and animated conversations. Sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, highlighting circles of young readers sprawled on colorful cushions. Near the entrance, the aroma of coffee wafted from a small stand operated by the local cafe, where parents gathered to chat and share stories while keeping watchful eyes on their children. Dominic Johnson walked through the transformed space, stopping occasionally to greet neighbors with warm handshakes and genuine smiles. His gaze drifted to where Chloe Johnson sat cross-legged beside Sophie Whitaker, both girls deeply engaged in discussing their favorite characters. Chloe Johnson's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as she pointed to something in an open book. Her previous hesitation around the store completely vanished. Near the reading nook, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker knelt beside a group of children, her designer clothes no longer a barrier between her and the young readers. She gestured animatedly as the children discussed the adventures of a brave princess in their picture book. "What do you think made her choose to help others?" she asked softly, listening intently as tiny hands shot up with eager answers. The children leaned in close, comfortable and trusting, a stark contrast to the fear she once inspired. Across the room, her eyes met Dominic Johnson's. They exchanged a knowing look, both understanding the journey that had brought them here. The path to redemption hadn't been easy, but the results were undeniable in every child's smile and every parent's relaxed demeanor. As the afternoon drew to a close and families began to drift home, Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker remained by the bookshelves, sharing a quiet moment. Chloe Johnson pulled out a small folded note from her pocket, carefully showing it to Sophie Whitaker. The paper contained Dominic Johnson's neat handwriting, praising Chloe Johnson's courage and her ability to show kindness even in difficult times. Sophie Whitaker read the words carefully, her eyes growing soft. "I wish my mom had learned to be kind sooner," she whispered, her voice carrying a hint of lingering sadness. Chloe Johnson touched her friend's arm gently. "What matters is that she's learning now," she replied, her voice full of wisdom beyond her years. The two girls stood together among the books, their friendship a testament to the store's transformation. They held themselves with quiet confidence, understanding that the changes around them meant more than just new reading circles and community gatherings. They represented the power of growth and second chances. Autumn painted the neighborhood in rich golds and crimsons, and a crisp breeze rustled the leaves outside the toy store's window. A handwritten sign announced the upcoming holiday toy drive, its cheerful letters promising warmth and generosity for the season ahead. Dominic Johnson pushed open the familiar door, a stack of fresh flyers tucked under his arm, and paused to take in the scene before him. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood near the counter, her attention focused on an elderly neighbor who spoke softly about finding the perfect gift for her grandchild. "I know exactly what might work," Mrs. Margaret Whitaker said warmly, leading the woman toward a display of educational toys. "This one encourages creativity and problem-solving." The genuine care in her voice made Dominic Johnson smile, remembering how far they'd all come from that painful summer day. Later that afternoon, in the cozy living room of the Johnson home, Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker sat cross-legged on a plush rug. Tiny teacups steamed between them as they shared treats Dominic Johnson had arranged on a small tray. Chloe Johnson held up several sheets of paper covered in her neat handwriting, reading aloud her story about two young friends and their mission to help a grumpy shopkeeper find joy through simple acts of kindness. Sophie Whitaker's eyes sparkled with recognition as she listened. "The shopkeeper sounds familiar," she giggled, understanding the parallel to their own experience. From his spot in the doorway, Dominic Johnson watched the girls share this moment, his heart swelling with pride at their ability to transform a difficult situation into something beautiful. As evening approached, rain began to tap gently against the toy store's windows. Inside, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker stood before a large chalkboard, carefully writing out the month's activities in her precise handwriting. Each line represented a new opportunity for connection: Tuesday Story Circle, Weekend Craft Workshop, International Games Day. She stepped back, reviewing her work with satisfaction. Sophie Whitaker appeared at her mother's side, reading the schedule with interest. Together, they stood in comfortable silence, mother and daughter united in the peaceful atmosphere they'd helped create. The store that had once been a source of tension now held the promise of continued growth and understanding. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker placed her arm around Sophie Whitaker's shoulders, and they shared a quiet moment of appreciation for how far they'd come. The morning sunlight streamed through Dominic Johnson's kitchen window, casting warm patterns across the wooden table, where Chloe Johnson carefully arranged wildflowers in a clear glass vase. She had gathered them during her early walk through the park with her father, each bloom representing a different shade of purple and yellow. As she positioned the last stem, she stepped back to admire how the colors complemented each other. "These remind me of the toy store now," Chloe Johnson said softly, touching a delicate purple petal. "How everything changed from being scary to being beautiful." Dominic Johnson watched his daughter from where he stood by the counter, a gentle smile crossing his face. "That's because people can grow, just like flowers," he explained, walking over to stand beside her. "When someone faces their mistakes with courage like Mrs. Whitaker did, good things can bloom from that." Chloe Johnson nodded thoughtfully, understanding the wisdom in her father's words. She had witnessed firsthand how his quiet strength and patience had guided their community through difficult times. At the toy store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker and Sophie Whitaker busied themselves preparing for the afternoon's special reading event. Colorful cushions formed a circle on the floor, and small tables displayed books from various countries. Sophie Whitaker carefully arranged story cards that explained different cultural traditions, while her mother adjusted the lighting to create a cozy atmosphere. The bell above the door chimed as Dominic Johnson entered, carrying a cardboard box filled with secondhand books. "Look what I found," he announced cheerfully, as Chloe Johnson followed him inside. He set the box down and began pulling out volumes with worn but beautiful covers. "This one's from India," he said, showing the girls a book with intricate patterns on its spine. "And here's another from Brazil." Sophie Whitaker and Chloe Johnson gathered around, their eyes wide with wonder as they examined the collection of international stories. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker approached the group, genuine interest showing on her face. "These will be perfect for today," she said, carefully taking a book about Japanese folktales. "The children will love learning about different places and traditions." As midday approached, the store filled with the soft murmur of voices and the gentle sound of pages turning. Children settled onto cushions, their faces expectant as a volunteer began reading from one of the new books. Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker sat together near the front, their shoulders touching as they leaned forward to catch every word. The story followed a young girl who faced difficulties in her village, but chose to respond with kindness rather than anger. As the volunteer's voice carried through the room, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker quietly joined the circle, settling onto a cushion near the two girls. Nobody moved or spoke about this unexpected moment. They simply listened together, absorbed in the tale of transformation and forgiveness. In the peaceful quiet, the past that had once divided them seemed to fade away. Chloe Johnson glanced briefly at Mrs. Margaret Whitaker, noticing how the woman's face had softened as she listened to the story. Sophie Whitaker smiled contentedly, feeling the harmony that had grown between them all. The morning light filtered through the store's windows, illuminating this scene of trust and understanding that had blossomed from once broken ground. Several weeks later, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Dominic Johnson and Chloe Johnson walked slowly past the toy store. The window display had transformed completely from that fateful day months ago. Vibrant posters announced upcoming free workshops and community gatherings, their cheerful colors drawing the eye. A large photograph showed Mrs. Margaret Whitaker surrounded by local children, her smile genuine and warm, a far cry from the stern woman she had once been. Chloe Johnson paused to study the display, her eyes lingering on a poster advertising next week's storytelling session. Dominic Johnson squeezed her hand gently, remembering the painful encounter that had started it all. That moment of hurt had sparked something unexpected, a journey that led their entire community toward understanding and redemption. Inside the store, Mrs. Margaret Whitaker and Sophie Whitaker moved with practiced ease as they prepared a cozy tea corner. Sophie Whitaker arranged chocolate biscuits on a decorative plate while her mother carefully filled a thermos with hot water. The setup was for the children who always arrived early for story time, eager to share treats and conversation before the tales began. Mrs. Margaret Whitaker glanced up through the window, catching Dominic Johnson's eye as he passed. They exchanged a brief, respectful nod. No words were necessary between them anymore. The gesture spoke volumes about how far they had come. Sophie Whitaker noticed the exchange and smiled to herself, feeling proud of the peace that now existed between her mother and the Johnsons. She straightened a teacup with careful fingers, appreciating how different things felt now. Later that evening, laughter echoed through Dominic Johnson's kitchen. Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker sat at the wooden table, their heads bent close together as they shared stories over steaming cups of tea. The kitchen light cast a warm glow over their happy faces, and occasional giggles burst forth like music. Dominic Johnson stood in the doorway watching the scene with quiet joy. His heart felt full at the sight of the two girls who had once been strangers, now sharing such easy friendship. He stepped into the room carrying a plate of warm pastries, their sweet aroma filling the air. Setting it down between the girls, he watched as they eagerly reached for the treats. Steam curled up from their teacups, dancing in the peaceful evening light. Through the kitchen window, the neighborhood lay quiet and serene. The toy store stood in the distance, its windows still glowing softly, a beacon of growth and unity in their community. The girls' laughter mixed with the gentle clink of teacups, creating a symphony of contentment that filled the room. Dominic Johnson pulled out a chair and sat with them, listening as Sophie Whitaker described a funny moment from that afternoon's story time. Chloe Johnson added her own observations, and both girls dissolved into giggles again. Their joy was infectious, spreading through the kitchen like warmth from the evening sun. If you enjoyed the story of Mrs. Whitaker, Chloe, and Dominic, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.